Vienna, 1954. Winter fog settles over the Rat-Hoskeller Tavern at 11:47 p.m. Two men sit across from each other beneath vaulted stone ceilings that have absorbed 3 centuries of smoke and secrets. Dr. John Ziegler, team physician for U.S. weightlifting, orders another round. His Soviet counterpart is drunk enough to talk. The Russian's hands shake, not from the cold, but from something else. His fingernails show vertical ridges. The skin on his knuckles splits like paper when he flexes. His liver, he mentions casually, feels enlarged when he presses his abdomen. He's 34 years old and looks 50. He describes what the State Science Committee injects into Soviet athletes. Pure testosterone, straight from the ampoule, 3 times per week. Ziegler writes nothing down. Within 5 years, he will give American lifters something he calls the pink pills. Within 15 years, some of those lifters will be dead. Within 40 years, the practice he begins tonight will kill hundreds of men who believe their bodies could be chemically rewritten without consequence. One sentence changes everything. The Russians weren't winning because they trained harder. They were winning because they had turned their athletes into experiments. Was this medical breakthrough or organized self-destruction? The physician who opened Pandora's bottle. Dr. John Bosley Ziegler returned to America with a problem and a theory. The problem was simple. Soviet lifters were dominating international competition with unnatural strength gains that appear between seasons. The theory required collaboration. In 1956, Ziegler approached Ciba Pharmaceuticals in Summit, New Jersey with a request. Develop an anabolic steroid with reduced androgenic effects, something that could build muscle without the severe side effects of straight testosterone. Ciba's chemists synthesized methylandrosterone. The FDA approved it in 1958 under a brand named Dianabol, marketed for burn victims, post-surgical recovery, and osteoporosis. The recommended medical dosage was 5 milligrams per day. Ziegler had other plans. In late 1959, he approached 4 lifters at the York Barbell Club in Pennsylvania: John Grymek, Bill March, Tony Garcia, and Louis Reek. These men became America's first bodybuilder guinea pigs. Ziegler's initial protocol was methodical: 5 milligrams daily for 2 weeks, then 10 milligrams, then 20 milligrams, followed by liver function tests and mandatory 6-week rest periods. He kept detailed records. He monitored blood work. He believed he could control the experiment. Bill March's transformation came first. Within 18 months, this average light heavyweight pressed 354.5 pounds and won a national championship. His arms grew 3 inches. His body weight increased by 42 pounds. Other lifters noticed. They wanted the pink pills. But by 1960, something had changed. Athletes began ignoring Ziegler's protocols entirely. They took 20 pills where he prescribed 1. They never stopped for rest periods. They purchased additional supplies through veterinarians who would write prescriptions for anything. What is it with these simple-minded shits? Ziegler complained to a colleague, "I'm the doctor," but he'd already lost control. The genie was loose. The pharmacy bottles were being emptied faster than he could fill them. In 1960, Ziegler gave Dianabol to the entire U.S. Olympic weightlifting team before they competed in Rome. Some historians consider this moment as the true birth of performance-enhanced modern athletics. Not in a Soviet laboratory, but in an American doctor's office, wrapped in a language of competitive necessity. The transformation spread like contagion. By 1963, Dianabol was being distributed through gym locker rooms across California. By 1965, Gold's Gym in Venice Beach had become an informal pharmaceutical exchange point where lifters shared dosages, stacks, and suppliers. By 1967, Ziegler quit working with York Barbell entirely, disillusioned and increasingly alarmed by what he'd started. He later experimented on himself, attempting to prove that steroids alone could not account for the massive gains he was witnessing. His own health deteriorated. He developed heart disease. Before his death in 1983, Ziegler gave one final interview to Bob Goldman, author Death in the Locker Room. His words carried the weight of a man watching his legacy mutate into something monstrous. It is bad enough to have to deal with drug addicts, but now healthy athletes are putting themselves in the same category. It's a disgrace. Who plays basketball now? Nobody. I'd like to go back and take that whole chapter out of my life. He died at age 62. His colleagues noted he looked 20 years older. The pink pills had done more than build muscle. They had rewritten the rules of human limitation. Or perhaps they had revealed that those rules had always been negotiable, provided you were willing to pay compound interest. What the first users saw in the mirror. Something happened to men who took Dianabol that couldn't be explained by muscle fiber hypertrophy alone. They described a psychological shift that felt, in their words, like waking up inside a different person's body. The change occurred approximately 3 weeks into the first cycle, a moment when the physical transformation became viscerally undeniable. Lou Reek, one of Ziegler's original 4 test subjects, recalled the sensation. You look in the mirror and not recognize the face looking back. The bone structure seemed different. The jaw was heavier. Even the skull felt denser when you touched it. This wasn't poetic exaggeration. Anabolic steroids increase growth hormone secretion, which stimulates bone formation in areas that haven't fully ossified: the jaw, the brow ridge, the hands and feet. Medical literature documents this as acromegalic features. But the lifters in 1960 had no medical literature. They only had mirrors and a creeping sense that they crossed a biological boundary they couldn't see clearly enough to avoid. Bill March described dreams that recurred throughout his 18-month transformation. In them, he was being rebuilt by invisible hands while he slept. He'd wake with the sensation of his skeleton expanding, his muscles swelling like rising bread dough, his skin stretching to accommodate something that wanted to be larger than his frame could contain. It felt exactly like those dreams, he told Ziegler during a checkup. Like something else was building me. Ziegler noted this in his records, but made no further comment. What could he say? The dreams were chemically induced. Certainly, testosterone and its analogs affect REM sleep architecture, increase slow-wave sleep, and alter the neurochemical environment where dreams are generated. But knowing the mechanism doesn't make the experience less unsettling. The men were dreaming about what was literally happening to them. They were being rebuilt. The metaphor was a reality. By 1965, this psychological phenomenon had spread to every gym where steroids were available. Bodybuilders began describing their relationship with drugs using the language of possession. They spoke about the gear or the juice as if it were a sentient force making demands. Arnold Schwarzenegger would later describe this relationship in Pumping Iron with disturbing clarity. You don't really see a muscle as a part of you, in a way. You see it as a thing, and you look at it as a thing, and it doesn't even seem to belong to you, like a sculpture. That dissociative language, it doesn't even seem to belong to you, became standard among elite bodybuilders. They trained body parts, not their bodies. They fed machine. They injected compounds into tissue. They referred to in third person. The psychological distance was necessary because the alternative was confronting an uncomfortable truth. They had voluntarily entered a pact where their bodies would be rebuilt according to specifications they couldn't fully control, using chemicals whose long-term effects no one understood, pursuing an aesthetic that required perpetual escalation. Or perhaps the explanation was simpler and more unsettling. Perhaps the transformation genuinely was happening to them, not by them. Perhaps once you introduce foreign hormones at superphysiological doses, you stop being the architect and become the construction site. The chemicals build what they want. You merely provide the raw materials and live inside the result. The underground economy, where the pills came from. By 1970, acquiring steroids required navigating a shadow economy that operated openly in plain sight. The supply chain began in pharmaceutical factories operating legally, producing drugs for legitimate medical purposes. Dianabol, decadurabolin, primobolan, Winstrol, all FDA approved, all prescribed by doctors, all traceable through standard pharmacy channels. But pharmaceutical companies were producing far more than hospitals needed. The surplus found its way to veterinarians, who prescribed steroids for livestock and racehorses. The veterinarians sold to lifters who claimed to own kennels or cattle operations. The lifters sold to other lifters. Money changed hands in gym parking lots, in locker rooms, in late-night meetings at diners near the Mexican border. The price structure in 1972 told its own story about access and demand. Dianabol tablets sold for $15 to $20 per 100 count. Decadurabolin vials went for $25 to $30. Primobolan depot ampoules commanded $40 to $50 each. Testosterone cypionate cost $20 to $25 per vial. These prices represented approximately one day's wages for a skilled tradesman, expensive but not prohibitive. The market operated on trust and reputation. You bought from someone who had been using for years, someone who competed, someone whose own physique proved the drugs worked. There were no quality controls, no purity tests, no way to verify what you were injecting except by the results it produced. The first major trafficking networks emerged in Southern California in the mid-1970s. Venice Beach became the geographic center of an informal distribution system that stretched from Tijuana to San Diego to Los Angeles to Bay Area. Certain gyms became known as connected, places where you could buy equipment, training advice, and pharmaceutical-grade anabolics from the same person behind the counter. One lifter who worked at Gold's Gym Venice between 1974 and 1978 later described the system. There was a room in the back, not a locker room, just a storage area. That's where you'd go if you needed gear. The guy would ask what you were running. If you were new, he'd recommend a basic cycle. If you were prepping for a show, he'd suggest something more aggressive. Prices were fixed. Cash only. No records. You walked out with a paper bag. The drugs came from multiple sources. Some were diverted from pharmacies. Employees would report bottles as damaged or lost in inventory. Some came from Mexico, where pharmaceutical regulations were essentially non-existent and pharmacies sold anything to anyone. Some came from veterinary suppliers who discovered that bodybuilders would pay double the price that ranchers paid. And increasingly, some were manufactured in underground laboratories that operated without any regulatory oversight whatsoever. The word underground is important here. These weren't sophisticated pharmaceutical operations. They were bathtub operations. People mixing raw powder with benzyl alcohol and sterile oil in residential kitchens, filtering the solution through coffee filters, filling vials with syringes, and applying computer-printed labels. The quality ranged from genuinely pharmaceutical grade to contaminated garbage that caused infections, abscesses, and blood poisoning. But the demand was insatiable. By 1980, an estimated 1 to 3 million Americans were using anabolic steroids, with bodybuilders representing only a small fraction of total users. High school athletes, powerlifters, football players, wrestlers, track athletes, bouncers, police officers, military personnel. Steroids had spread beyond competitive athletics into general culture. Any man who wanted to look impressive or feel powerful could obtain them with minimal effort. The economic incentives were obvious. A single batch of underground testosterone, produced for approximately $200 in raw materials, could be sold for $3,000 to $4,000 at street-level prices. The profit margins rivaled cocaine. And unlike cocaine, steroids weren't federally controlled substances. Possession was legal. Distribution for non-medical purposes was technically illegal under FDA regulations, but enforcement was virtually non-existent. The worst consequence for getting caught was typically a fine. This legal ambiguity created an atmosphere where the underground economy operated with minimal fear of prosecution. Dealers advertised in bodybuilding magazines using coded language, pharmaceutical-grade supplements, serious mass-building nutrition, European training aids. Readers understood. The ads included P.O. boxes and phone numbers. Money orders were acceptable. The entire system functioned on a collective agreement that steroids weren't really drugs in the dangerous sense. They were tools. Everyone knew the risks were real but theoretical. Everyone knew someone who'd been using for a decade with no apparent problems. Everyone knew the rewards were immediate and undeniable. The economic equation made perfect sense. Pay $200, gain 20 pounds of muscle in 3 months, become competitive, possibly win prize money. Definitely get more attention. The math was simple. What nobody calculated was compound interest. The body keeps receipts. It bills you later with interest, and the currency it demands isn't dollars. The doctors who became dealers. The transformation of the medical profession's relationship with steroids followed a predictable trajectory, from cautious prescribing to open distribution to criminal enterprise. Dr. Robert Kerr established his San Gabriel, California practice in 1967 with a specialization that would have seemed absurd to most physicians. He treated athletes specifically for steroid use. His approach was revolutionary and deeply troubling in equal measure. He didn't pretend steroids weren't being used. He didn't moralize. He simply offered medical supervision, comprehensive testing, and carefully calculated dosing protocols in exchange for $70 per initial visit and approximately $150 per month for ongoing care. By 1982, when he published The Practical Use of Anabolic Steroid with Athletes, Kerr claimed to have treated more than 4,000 athletes from 20 countries. By 1983, estimates exceeded 10,000 patients. Over half of his practice involved anabolic steroid patients. He conducted 9 urine tests, comprehensive blood panels, and sperm counts every 3 months. He monitored liver enzymes, lipid profiles, and cardiovascular markers. He approached steroid use the way another doctor might approach diabetes management, as a chronic condition requiring ongoing medical oversight. Kerr's philosophy was simple and disturbing. This is not cheating, not when everyone does it. He testified at the 1989 Canadian Dubin inquiry that he provided anabolic steroids for approximately 20 athletes who won medals at the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics. He made the statement under oath, with no apparent sense that he was confessing to anything problematic. In his worldview, he was simply acknowledging reality. Steroids were ubiquitous. Medical supervision was harm reduction. He was providing a service. Kerr died of a heart attack in 2003 at age 65. His colleagues noted he'd been suffering from cardiovascular disease for years. Whether his own steroid use, he admitted to self-experimentation, contributed to his death remains a matter for speculation. What's undeniable is that he helped normalize physician-supervised steroid use, which in turn normalized the premise that chemical enhancement was medically acceptable provided a doctor's signature appeared on prescription pad. But Kerr operated in the light. The darker medical story belonged to physicians who operated purely as drug dealers wearing white coats. Dr. George T. Zahorian III practiced urology in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, while simultaneously serving as the ringside physician for the World Wrestling Federation between 1981 and 1991. He supplied steroids to 37 WWF wrestlers, operating what prosecutors would later describe as a cash-and-carry pharmaceutical distribution system. His method was elegantly simple. At wrestling events, he'd rent a hotel room. Wrestlers would line up in the hallway. They'd knock. He'd open the door. They'd tell him what they wanted. He'd quote a price. They'd pay cash. He'd hand them bottles. The transaction would take less than 60 seconds. Then the next wrestler would knock. I got it. You pay me. You got it. Zahorian told one client, summarizing his entire business model. He made no pretense of medical supervision, no examinations, no blood tests, no monitoring. He was purely a supplier who happened to have a medical license that allowed him to write prescriptions and order pharmaceutical products. In June 1991, federal prosecutors convicted Zahorian on 14 counts of steroid distribution. In December 1991, Judge William Caldwell sentenced him to 3 years in federal prison. His prosecution triggered a federal investigation into Vince McMahon and the WWF, leading to McMahon's 1993 indictment on charges of conspiracy to distribute steroids. McMahon was ultimately acquitted in July 1994, but Zahorian's conviction established a precedent. Physicians who distributed steroids without legitimate medical purpose were drug dealers, and they would be prosecuted as such. The most disturbing physician dealer operated internationally. Dr. Jamie Astafan, a St. Kitts-born physician who graduated from the University of Toronto Faculty of Medicine in 1971, became the personal physician to sprinter Ben Johnson and several other world-class Canadian athletes. His fee structure was simple: $10,000 per month for pharmaceutical supervision. He injected Ben Johnson with steroids between 50 and 60 times over 5 years leading up to the 1988 Seoul Olympics. But Astafan's real innovation was deception, not of authorities, but of his own clients. He told athletes they were receiving estragol or furazabol, supposedly undetectable Japanese steroids. In reality, he was injecting them with Winstrol V, the veterinary formulation designed for horses, because it was cheaper and he could pocket the difference. His clients trusted him completely. They had no reason not to. He was a doctor. He spoke the language of medicine. He claimed to be protecting them from detection, while simultaneously setting them up for disgrace. When Ben Johnson tested positive in Seoul, Astafan's entire operation collapsed. The Dubin inquiry in 1989 exposed his methods in excruciating detail. Justice Charles Dubin issued a scathing rebuke. Astafan had perverted the morals of young athletes by making the use of banned drugs seem acceptable. In June 1991, the Ontario College of Physicians and Surgeons suspended Astafan's license for 18 months. He moved to Florida. In 1995, he was convicted of conspiracy to distribute cocaine and steroids and served 2 years in federal prison. He died of a heart attack in St. Kitts on August 18, 2006, at age 60. No major news outlet covered his death. He'd become a footnote in the history he'd helped create. These physicians shared a common characteristic. They all believed they were providing a service. They all rationalized their activities as meeting demand rather than creating it. They all suffered consequences, legal, professional, or medical, but only after enabling thousands of athletes to obtain drugs that would permanently alter their bodies and, in some cases, end their lives prematurely. The Jenkins-DeShane empire, $100 million in muscle. By the mid-1980s, the underground steroid economy had evolved from informal gym networks into sophisticated international trafficking operations. The largest operation ever prosecuted began in Mexico and ended in San Diego federal court. In May 1987, the U.S. Attorney's Office filed indictments naming 36 co-conspirators in what prosecutors described as history's largest steroid trafficking conspiracy. The ring allegedly controlled 70% of the U.S. black market for anabolic steroids, with an estimated value of $100 million. The operation's architect was David Jenkins, British Olympic silver medalist in the 4x400-meter relay at Munich 1972. After his athletic career ended, Jenkins relocated to Southern California and identified a simple economic opportunity. American bodybuilders needed steroids. Mexican pharmaceutical manufacturing was largely unregulated, and the U.S.-Mexico border was porous. He partnered with Mexican businessman Juan Javier Maclis to establish Laboratorios Milano in Tijuana, a pharmaceutical manufacturing facility that operated with nominal oversight and unlimited ambition. The scale of Milano's operation was industrial. When Mexican federal police raided the facility in April 1989, they seized nearly 5 tons of precursor chemicals sourced from suppliers in Europe and China. The laboratory employed chemists capable of synthesizing multiple steroid compounds. They produced tablets, injectables, and transdermal preparations. They printed professional packaging. They created brand names. To most consumers, Milano's products were indistinguishable from legitimate pharmaceutical steroids. The distribution network stretched across the United States. Jenkins employed a multi-tiered system where regional distributors purchased bulk quantities, which they then sold to gym-based dealers, who sold to individual users. The profit margins were extraordinary at every level. Raw materials costing $1,000 could be converted into products selling for $50,000 at retail prices. The business model was identical to narcotics trafficking, except the legal penalties were far less severe and the customer base was far larger. In October 1989, the operation revealed a detail that transformed it from a criminal enterprise into a geopolitical scandal. General Manuel Noriega, military dictator of Panama, was identified as a principal owner of Laboratorios Milano. The steroid operation wasn't merely a business. It was a money laundering mechanism for a narco-state. American bodybuilders purchasing Mexican steroids were unknowingly funding Central American cocaine trafficking. Jenkins was arrested in Oceanside, California in April 1987. Federal prosecutors initially sought a lengthy prison sentence. Judge A. Lawrence Irving sentenced him to 7 years. But Jenkins became a cooperating witness, providing detailed testimony about the operation structure, financing, and distribution networks. After his cooperation, his sentence was reduced dramatically. He served 9 months at Boron Federal Prison Camp, a minimum security facility in the Mojave Desert, and was released. Jenkins' partner in the public consciousness, though not in the Milano operation itself, was Dan Deschênes, the steroid guru. Deschênes' contribution was educational rather than manufacturing. In 1981, he published the original Underground Steroid Handbook, an 18-page pamphlet that demystified steroid use for thousands of athletes who had no access to medical guidance. The handbook sold 40 to 50,000 copies at $6 each through advertisements in bodybuilding magazines and sold for a fortune. It explained dosing protocols, stacking strategies, side effect management, and post-cycle recovery. USOC Chief Medical Officer Robert Voy called it a fabulous pharmacological text, which was simultaneously a compliment to its accuracy and an indictment of its purpose. Deschênes had created a user's manual for chemical self-experimentation. Deschênes' philosophy was refreshingly honest. Steroids work. Everyone knows they work. The question isn't whether to use them. The question is how to use them intelligently. He advocated for blood testing, medical supervision, and cycling protocols designed to minimize harm. He positioned himself as a harm reduction educator in an environment where most information was rumor and myth. The federal government viewed him differently. In 1987, Deschênes was convicted in connection with the Jenkins operation and sentenced to 3 years with 5 years probation. He served 10 months. In 1991, he was convicted again, this time for distributing GHB, and sentenced to 36 months. He served that sentence as well. Deschênes died on January 12, 2000 from polycystic kidney disease at age 47. Friends noted he'd been suffering from kidney problems for years, complications almost certainly related to decades of steroid use. His kidneys failed because they processed too many foreign hormones for too many years. The chemicals he'd spent his life advocating for had killed him. The Jenkins-Deschênes era represents the peak of the pre-enforcement steroid economy. The business model was sophisticated, the profits were enormous, the legal risks were minimal, and the customer base believed they were purchasing tools rather than drugs. The operation's collapse in 1987 to 1989 marked the beginning of the end for the legal ambiguity that had allowed the underground economy to flourish. But it didn't stop the trade. It merely drove it deeper underground, where quality control disappeared entirely and the health consequences became even more severe. The numbers, when madness becomes statistical. The underground steroid economy in 1985 operated at a scale that defied casual dismissal. Between 1 and 3 million Americans were using anabolic steroids, though competitive athletes represented only 15 to 20% of that population. The average 12-week steroid cycle cost between $300 and $600. The gross annual black market revenue reached somewhere between $100 and $300 million. Southern California alone housed 50 to 75 underground laboratories. By mid-decade, between 40 and 60% of all steroids in circulation came from underground manufacture rather than pharmaceutical diversion. Dr. Robert Kerr's patient statistics documented the medical profession's complicity. Between 1967 and 1984, he treated over 10,000 athletes from 20 countries. More than half of his practice involved steroid patients. Initial consultations cost $70. Monthly monitoring cost $150. He provided steroids to approximately 20 athletes who won medals at the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics. His patients used between 2 and 4 compounds simultaneously. At least one patient remained under his care for 17 continuous years. The Jenkins-Deschênes trafficking operation controlled 70% of the U.S. market at its peak, valued at $100 million. 36 co-conspirators were indicted. Mexican federal police seized 5 tons, 10,000 pounds, of precursor chemicals in Tijuana. Deschênes' underground steroid handbook sold between 40 and 50,000 copies. His total time served across both convictions was 46 months. Jenkins served 9 months after cooperation. The pharmaceutical timeline revealed how quickly the chemical landscape expanded. Niovar became the first anabolic steroid approved for medical use in 1956. Dianabol, received FDA approval in 1958. Organon marketed Decadurabolin globally in 1960. Primobolan Depot was approved in 1961. The same year, East German pharmaceutical company Genopharm patented oral turinabol for state athletic programs. Trenbolone acetate was synthesized in 1963. Anavar received FDA approval in 1964. By the mid-1980s, the FDA's 20-year drug review removed most anabolic steroids from the U.S. pharmaceutical market, inadvertently catalyzing the underground boom. Black market prices in 1985 reflected both demand and risk. Dianabol tablets sold for $35 to $50 per 100-count bottle. Decadurabolin cost $80 to $100 for a 10-milliliter vial. Testosterone cypionate went for $60 to $80 per vial. Primobolan Depot ampoules commanded $15 to $20 each. Anadrol cost $150 to $200 per bottle. Winstrol tablets sold for $75 to $100. Underground Trenbolone acetate cost $120 to $150 per 10-milliliter vial. For context, median U.S. household income in 1985 was approximately $27,000 annually, $2,300 per month. A competitive bodybuilder's contest preparation expenses range from $800 to $2,000, representing 35 to 85% of a month's median income. The physical transformation metrics bodybuilders reported followed predictable patterns. First cycle muscle gains averaged 15 to 25 pounds over 12 weeks. Strength increases range from 20 to 40% across major lifts. Achieving the same gains naturally would require 2 to 4 years. After discontinuation, users retained 50 to 70% of gains. Natural testosterone production required 6 to 24 months to fully recover. Between 10 and 30% of users never fully recovered natural production. Dr. Ziegler's original Dianabol recommendations call for 5 to 10 milligrams daily with mandatory rest periods. By 1975, typical bodybuilder dosages reached 30 to 50 milligrams daily with no rest periods. By the 1980s, extreme dosages reached 100 to 150 milligrams daily, 10 to 15 times higher than medical recommendations. The East German State Plan 14.25 systematically doped approximately 9,000 athletes between 1974 and 1989. The youngest athlete given steroids was 12 years old. Oral turinabol was a primary compound. Hundreds of physicians and scientists participated. Between 2,000 and 3,000 athletes suffered permanent health damage. Only 2 high-level officials were convicted in post-reunification trials, both receiving probation. Total compensation paid to victims as of 2002 was approximately €4 million divided among thousands. Gerd Bonk represented the highest documented annual steroid intake. Between 1978 and 1979, he consumed 12,775 milligrams of steroids total, including 11,550 milligrams of oral turinabol, an average daily dosage of 35 milligrams, nearly 7 times the maximum recommended medical dose. He used steroids for approximately 10 years from 1975 to 1985. He died in 2014 at age 63. Andreas Münzer's death at age 31 on March 14, 1996 became the most thoroughly documented steroid fatality. The cause was dystrophic multiple organ failure. His liver weighed 2.9 kilograms compared to a normal 2 kilograms. His heart weighed 636 grams compared to a normal 300 to 350 grams. Toxicology detected approximately 20 distinct drugs. He maintained near-zero body fat year-round on just 2,000 calories daily while weighing 250 pounds. He underwent 2 unsuccessful surgeries before death. The veterinary drug pipeline operated at scale. Trenbolone acetate offered approximately 5 times testosterone's anabolic potency. Each standard cattle implant contained 10 pellets of 20 milligrams each, 200 milligrams total. Street prices for converted Trenbolone reached $40 to $60 for a 2-milliliter vial in the late 1980s. Between 80 and 90% of bodybuilding Trenbolone originated as cattle implants. By 2002, Sports Illustrated investigators counted more than 50 pharmacies within 6 blocks in Tijuana selling veterinary steroids. Federal enforcement statistics revealed the legal transformation. Between 1980 and 1987, fewer than 10 federal prosecutions occurred for steroid trafficking. After passage of the 1988 Anti-Drug Abuse Act, federal prosecutors filed 125 cases across 27 states between 1988 and 1990. Before 1988, maximum penalties typically involved fines and probation. After the 1990 Anabolic Steroids Control Act, first offense distribution carried 5 years maximum prison time. Distribution to persons under 18 carried a 10-year mandatory minimum for first offense. Dr. Zahorian supplied 37 WWF wrestlers over approximately 10 years from 1981 to 1991. His federal sentence was 3 years. Vince McMahon faced charges in July 1993, but was acquitted in July 1994. These numbers documented not just a black market, but a biological experiment conducted on a national scale. The scale had a price, and the price was denominated in enlarged hearts, failed livers, and bodies that demanded compound interest on every chemical loan. The transformation is possession when muscle becomes obsession. Somewhere between the 3rd and 5th month of continuous steroid use, a percentage of users develop a perceptual disorder that bodybuilders simply call never being big enough. Dr. Harrison Pope at Harvard Medical School coined the term muscle dysmorphia in 1993 after studying 108 male bodybuilders. 10% met full diagnostic criteria, with another 20% showing subclinical symptoms. The diagnostic markers read like a catalog of elite bodybuilder behaviors: preoccupation with the idea that one's body is too small, significant distress or impairment in functioning, continued engagement despite knowledge of adverse consequences, use of anabolic steroids despite awareness of health risks, and avoidance of situations where the body will be exposed. The mechanism appears bidirectional. Individuals with pre-existing body image issues gravitate towards steroids. But steroid use intensifies dysmorphic symptoms by creating a physique that requires continuous pharmaceutical maintenance. Once you've built chemically enhanced muscle, your natural genetic potential looks inadequate by comparison. You can't maintain steroid-built muscle without steroids. The cycle traps you. Stopping means losing what you've built, which triggers existential terror. Arnold Schwarzenegger articulated this dissociation in the 1977 documentary Pumping Iron. Speaking about training philosophy, he described the sensation. You don't really see a muscle as a part of you in a way. You see it as a thing, and you look at it as a thing, and it doesn't even seem to belong to you, like a sculpture, not like your arm, not like your body, like an object you're shaping. This perceptual distortion has neurological correlates. A 2008 fMRI study examined brain activation patterns in bodybuilders with muscle dysmorphia. When shown images of their own bodies, subjects showed reduced activation in the medial prefrontal cortex, the region associated with self-recognition and self-evaluation. Their brains process their own bodies differently than control subjects process theirs. Chronic supraphysiological androgen exposure appears to disrupt the neurological integration of physical self-perception. Steve McCallick's case illustrates the terminal stage. He described his relationship with steroids with chilling clarity. The drugs were running me. I wasn't running the drugs. I'd wake up every morning, and the first thought wasn't, what am I doing today? It was, what am I taking today? The chemicals wanted to be fed. They demanded it, and you fed them because if you didn't, you'd shrink. And shrinking felt like dying. McCallick's stack at peak usage included 14 different steroids simultaneously: Anadrol, Dianabol, multiple testosterone esters, Decadurabolin, Winstrol, Primobolan, Halotestin, Equipoise, Phenoplix, and several compounds he couldn't remember. He supplemented with amphetamines for training and barbiturates for sleep. He even purchased monkey skulls to extract growth hormone from hypothalamus glands using black market protocols. He developed baseball-sized liver tumors. He pissed blood for months from kidney damage. He suffered a heart attack and stroke. He required a kidney transplant in 2011. The transplant failed to restore quality of life. On May 24, 2012, he committed suicide at age 62. His autopsy revealed end-stage organ disease throughout his body. Whether this represents genuine possession or extreme psychological dependency is semantics. The experience is identical. The individual believes they are no longer in control. The chemicals are in control. The body has its own agenda. And the conscious mind is simply the operator trying to keep the machine running. The horror isn't that it's irrational. The horror is that it's completely rational. Once you've chemically rewritten your physiology, you can't maintain the result without chemical maintenance. The choice is binary. Keep using or accept atrophy. For men whose entire identity is built on their physiques, atrophy is psychological suicide. So they keep using, and the drugs keep building. And the person who started the journey becomes a distant memory of someone who used to exist before the transformation began. The death toll when the body presents the bill. There's a pattern in the obituaries of bodybuilders who use heavy steroids. The causes of death are listed as heart failure, liver failure, kidney failure, but the true cause is never mentioned explicitly. Andreas Münzer died on March 14, 1996, at age 31. The immediate cause was multiple organ failure. His liver weighed 2.9 kilograms, nearly 50% larger than normal, and consisted partially of a crumbly mass similar to polystyrene. His heart weighed 636 grams, twice the normal weight. The autopsy report noted approximately 20 different drugs in his system. The medical examiner concluded that this death resulted from long-term anabolic steroid abuse combined with diuretic abuse and malnutrition. Münzer had maintained near-zero body fat year-round on 2,000 calories per day while weighing 250 pounds. His organs had been operating in crisis mode for years. They simply ran out of capacity. Mohammed Benaziza died on October 4th, 1992, at age 33, hours after winning the Dutch Grand Prix. He was found dead in his hotel room. The cause was cardiac arrest from severe dehydration caused by diuretic abuse. Witnesses at the event recalled that he could barely walk to collect his trophy. His body was completely depleted, every ounce of subcutaneous water removed to achieve maximum muscle definition. His blood had thickened to syrup. His heart couldn't pump it. Eyewitness Milo Sarcev later said his body was so hard, like granite, but he could not even walk. Mike Matarazzo, 7-time Mr. Olympia competitor, underwent triple bypass surgery in 2004 at age 38. His coronary arteries were 75 to 100% blocked. Surgeons installed a defibrillator in 2007. He received regular dialysis for failing kidneys. In 2014, while awaiting a heart transplant, he died at age 48. His heart function had declined to 20 to 25% of normal capacity. Before his death, Matarazzo gave a 2005 interview to Flex magazine that reads like a warning from beyond the grave. "I know it was the drugs that caused this to happen, and I don't care what anyone says." All the gurus and self-proclaimed steroid experts who try to downplay the risks are talking out their asses. Trust me, I used steroids for 23 years, and I'm living proof that the consequences are real and serious. Just watch. I bet we will be seeing more serious heart problems and worse when they get to their 40s. He was correct. The generation that came of age in the 1980s and 1990s, when steroid dosages escalated dramatically, began dying in their 40s and 50s in numbers that far exceeded actuarial predictions. The cardiovascular consequences are well documented in medical literature. A 2018 meta-analysis reviewing 24 studies found that left ventricular hypertrophy appeared in 30 to 70% of users. Cardiac function decreased by 10 to 15% in chronic users. Coronary artery disease occurred 2 to 3 times more commonly than in age-matched controls. Sudden cardiac death risk was 4 to 5 times higher, and atrial fibrillation and other arrhythmias showed significantly elevated risk. Arnold Schwarzenegger, remarkably candid about his own use, issued a warning in 2023 that acknowledged a generational shift. Now people are dying. They're dying because of overdoses of drugs, and they don't know what the fuck they're doing. Back in our day, we took it all year long, but we took very few doses. 100 milligrams a week of testosterone, or something like that. It was nothing. Now, people are taking it from the gym They get advice from people who are not qualified. The doses are far more extreme, and people are dying. The body always presents a bill. Steroids work by forcing biological systems to operate beyond their design capacity. For years, sometimes decades, the body compensates. But compensation has limits. Eventually, the liver can't detoxify anymore. The heart can't pump anymore. The kidneys can't filter anymore. And the person who spent their youth building an enhanced physique spends their middle age watching that physique collapse while their organs fail. The 1990 line, when everything changed overnight. On November 29, 1990, President George H.W. Bush signed the Anabolic Steroids Control Act into law as Title 19 of the Crime Control Act of 1990. Effective February 27, 1991, anabolic steroids became Schedule III controlled substances under the Controlled Substances Act. Overnight, possession without a prescription became a federal crime punishable by up to 1 year in prison and a $1,000 fine for a first offense. Distribution carried a maximum sentence of 5 years. Distribution to minors carried a maximum sentence of 10 years for a first offense, 30 years for repeat offenders. What's remarkable about the 1990 Act is who opposed it. The FDA opposed scheduling. The DEA opposed scheduling. The National Institute on Drug Abuse opposed scheduling. The American Medical Association opposed scheduling. Every major medical and regulatory body argued that anabolic steroids did not meet the criteria for controlled substance classification. DEA Chief of Operations Gene Hayslip testified in 1988 that the DEA did not support scheduling because these substances did not produce psychoactive effects typically associated with drugs of abuse. There was no evidence of significant diversion into black markets, and there was no evidence that steroid abuse led to physical or psychological dependence in the manner of narcotics or stimulants. The AMA's Council on Scientific Affairs submitted testimony stating that medical facts did not support classification as controlled substances, that anabolic steroids had legitimate medical uses, and that while abuse occurred, particularly in athletic settings, this abuse did not lead to dependence requiring a level of control appropriate for Schedule III substances. Congress ignored these recommendations. Senator Joseph Biden led the charge, arguing that steroids were both dangerous and addictive, presenting the same threats to society as other hard drugs, and that athletes using these drugs sent a message to young people that chemical enhancement was acceptable. The immediate impact on the bodybuilding community was seismic. The 1990 Mr. Olympia, held October 20th in Chicago, was the first Olympia where drug testing was implemented. The IFBB announced the show would be drug tested in response to pending legislation. Competitors submitted urine samples. The results were farcical. Testing was announced months in advance. Testing covered only a handful of known compounds. Athletes simply adjusted protocols, switching to fast-clearing drugs and stopping weeks before the event. Lee Haney won his 8th consecutive title, looking noticeably smaller than previous years. Many competitors appeared softer, flatter, less conditioned. The drug-tested era lasted exactly 1 year. In 1991, the IFBB abandoned mandatory testing, acknowledging that competitive bodybuilding was chemically enhanced and testing would either destroy the sport or be circumvented. But the legal environment had permanently changed. Where previously steroids could be purchased openly with minimal legal risk, now possession and distribution carried serious federal penalties. The market responded by going deeper underground. Manufacturing shifted to purely illicit laboratories. Quality control vanished. Contamination rates increased. Prices rose. The first major prosecution under the new law targeted Dr. George Ahorian in 1991. His conviction and 3-year sentence sent a message. The medical license would not protect physicians from prosecution if they distributed steroids for non-medical purposes. Zahorian's conviction triggered the 1993 federal indictment of Vince McMahon. Though McMahon was acquitted in July 1994, the trial damaged WWF's public image. The 1990 Act created criminals without reducing harm. The behavior continued, but safety mechanisms vanished. The law drew a political line rather than a medical one, and the consequence was predictable. Usage patterns persisted while physician oversight disappeared. Gold's Gym Venice, the mecca of chemical experimentation. Gold's Gym Venice opened in August 1965 at 1006 Pacific Avenue in a concrete block building that one member described as having all the amenities of a morgue. Joe Gold's vision was simple: a serious training facility for serious lifters. Custom equipment built from scrap metal, solid iron weights, unframed mirrors, inadequate ventilation, no air conditioning, no amenities beyond barbells and benches. Membership cost $40 to $60 per year. Frank Zane recalled the atmosphere. It was all serious people. Just silence. You didn't hear music. You didn't hear conversation. Just the sound of weights and breathing. And you had access to all that equipment. That really was the mecca. The term stuck. But Gold's significance extended beyond equipment. It was where underground pharmaceutical knowledge passed from generation to generation. It was where you learned not just how to train, but how to cycle steroids, where to source them, how to stack them, how to manage side effects, how to time usage around competitions. The system was informal but sophisticated. Experienced bodybuilders mentored newcomers through oral tradition passed in quiet corner conversations. John Ballack explained evolution. It was mostly Dianabol at first, then Arnold brought Primobolan from Europe, and that became popular. It evolved through competitive people who weren't afraid to experiment on themselves. Someone would try a new compound or dosage, and if it worked, everyone else would follow. It was collaborative experimentation. Rick Drazen described a medical pipeline. We'd go see this pediatrician on Hollywood Boulevard. One side of the waiting room was pregnant mothers and kids. The other side was bodybuilders. Then he'd give you your shots. I think he charged maybe $15 or $20. It seemed totally normal. Eddie Giuliani recalled the Mexican connection. Guys would drive down to Mexico with a broad and a kid. Me and my wife came down to spend the afternoon. They'd say to border guards, and meanwhile the trunk was full of shit. Testosterone, Deca, Winstrol, whatever you could buy. It was like grocery shopping. The loft upstairs was where the more private business occurred. Members would dose themselves away from the training floor. It wasn't secretive exactly. Everyone knew, but it wasn't advertised. The gym maintained plausible deniability. Training sessions often lasted 3 to 4 hours. Bodybuilders performed 25 to 30 sets per body part. They trained to failure, then did force reps. They used every intensity technique designed to inflict maximum muscular damage. Drop sets, rest pause sets, supersets, trisets, giant sets. Arnold's training philosophy captured the mindset. The only way to be a champion is by going through these forced reps and the torture and pain. That's why I call it the torture routine. Because it's like that. You torture yourself. The word torture wasn't hyperbole. Boyarko summarized the culture with brutal honesty. If you eliminated anabolic steroids for a contest and the curtains would open, guess how many people would be standing on stage? Nobody. This wasn't an admission of weakness. It was a statement of fact. The question wasn't whether to use, but how to use most effectively. Gold's Venice closed its original location in 1979 after real estate development forced them out. The gym moved to Hampton Drive, where it remains as a tourist attraction. The culture changed. The mythology grew. But for a decade in the 1970s, Gold's was the epicenter, where the boundaries of human physical potential were being chemically rewritten. It was where knowledge was passed, drugs were shared, and champions were forged through iron, pain, and pharmaceuticals. And where they learned to inject themselves with compounds that made them something more than human and something less than healthy. The East German machine, when the state became the dealer. In 1974, the German Democratic Republic formalized what had been occurring informally for years: systematic state-sponsored doping of athletes under State Plan 14.25. The program operated through the Manfred von Ardenne Research Institute, supervised by the Ministry of Sport and the Sports Medical Service. Hundreds of physicians and scientists participated. The scale was industrial. Approximately 9,000 athletes received steroids between 1968 and 1989, many of them minors, some as young as 12. The primary compound was oral Dianabol, a modified testosterone developed by East German pharmaceutical company Genopharm, unique to East Germany, never marketed in the West, designed specifically for athletic enhancement. Athletes received the drug disguised as vitamins or supporting substances. Parents weren't informed. Athletes weren't informed. Consent was manufactured through authority. Gerd Bonk's case was the most extreme. Medical records revealed he consumed 12,775 milligrams of steroids in a single year, including 11,550 milligrams of oral Dianabol, approximately 35 milligrams per day, nearly 7 times a maximum recommended medical dosage. He took these doses for approximately 10 years. His body served as a testing ground for determining human tolerance limits. The most disturbing aspect wasn't the medical experimentation. It was the age of subjects. Girls as young as 12 were recruited and given steroids without informed consent. Many developed irreversible changes before understanding what was being done to them. Heidi Krieger was recruited into East Germany's shot put program at 16. She received oral Dianabol disguised as vitamins. Over several years, as testosterone levels climbed to male-typical ranges, she underwent progressive masculinization. Her voice deepened. Her body composition changed. Her bone structure altered. Her psychological gender identity shifted. In 1997, after years of distress, she underwent sex reassignment surgery and became Andreas Krieger. At the 2000 trial, Krieger testified, "They just used me like a machine. They destroyed me. I'm a human being, but they treated me like a test subject." In 1998, German prosecutors charged the architects of State Plan 14.25. The defendants included Manfred Ewald, Minister of Sport, and Dr. Manfred Hoppner, Chief of the Sports Medical Service, charged as accessories to intentional bodily harm of athletes, including minors. The trial revealed systematic knowledge of harmful side effects and deliberate decisions to continue despite documented damage. Internal memos showed officials concluded that international sports success justified harm to individual athletes. The verdict was remarkably lenient. Both were convicted, but neither received prison time. Ewald was sentenced to a suspended 22-month term and fined 7,500 marks. Hoppner received a similar suspended sentence. The court concluded that while their actions caused harm, they were operating within the legal framework of the East German state at the time. Victims received compensation, but amounts were modest. As of 2002, approximately 200 athletes had received payments totaling about 4 million euros, an average of 20,000 euros per person. This represented the state's valuation of lifelong health complications, including cardiac disease, liver damage, infertility, and permanent masculinization. The East German program represents a logical endpoint of viewing athletes as state resources rather than individual humans. When performance becomes the only metric, the body becomes a laboratory. When the state controls both athletes and pharmaceutical infrastructure, there's no mechanism for consent or refusal. The veterinary pipeline and invisible killers. The strangest chapter involves compounds designed for livestock being diverted to human use. Trenbolone acetate represents the pinnacle of this pipeline. Synthesized in 1963 and approved in the early 1970s as Phenoplex, subcutaneous pellets implanted in cattle ears to promote muscle growth. Each pellet contained 20 milligrams. A standard implant contained 10 pellets, 200 milligrams total. Cattle implants were available for purchase by anyone claiming to operate a ranch. No veterinary prescription required. Suppliers shipped through agricultural catalogs. Bodybuilders ordered them in bulk, extracted the pellets, and converted them to injectable form. The process was crude but effective. Crush pellets into powder, dissolve in benzyl alcohol and benzyl benzoate, add sterile oil, heat for sterilization, filter through 0.22 micron filter, fill sterile vials. The result was injectable Trenbolone at approximately 75 to 100 milligrams per milliliter concentration. Trenbolone offered properties that made it extraordinarily popular, approximately 5 times more anabolic than testosterone. Doesn't convert to estrogen, producing dry gains without water retention, dramatically increases nutrient efficiency, creates the hard, grainy, vascular appearance that defines competitive conditioning. The side effects were equally dramatic. Insomnia, night sweats, elevated blood pressure, severe anxiety, suppressed testosterone production more thoroughly than other steroids, distinctive tren cough, violent coughing fits after injection, and apparent neurotoxicity with persistent cognitive effects, including anxiety, paranoia, and aggression even after discontinuation. By the 1990s, an estimated 80 to 90% of competitive bodybuilders used Trenbolone during contest preparation. It became synonymous with elite conditioning. But Trenbolone wasn't the only killer. Insulin and diuretics proved even more immediately dangerous. By the early 1990s, bodybuilders began experimenting with insulin, a drug designed for diabetic survival, but discovered to shuttle nutrients into muscle cells. The typical protocol: inject 5 to 10 IU of rapid-acting insulin 30 minutes before training, then consume 10 grams of carbohydrates per IU during workout. The margin for error was terrifyingly narrow. Any miscalculation could cause severe hypoglycemia. Dallas McCarver died on August 22, 2017, at age 26 after choking on food during an insulin-induced hypoglycemic episode. Rich Piana collapsed on August 7, 2017, and died 20 days later. His girlfriend told police Piana had been using insulin regularly. Both deaths illustrated insulin's acute danger. Steroids damage organs slowly over decades, but insulin can kill in hours. Diuretics completed the lethal triad. Bodybuilders used them in final days before competition to eliminate subcutaneous water. The drugs force kidneys to excrete water and electrolytes. When used by dehydrated athletes trying to eliminate every ounce of water, they cause cardiac arrhythmia triggered by electrolyte imbalances. Potassium and sodium regulate cardiac electrical activity. When diuretics deplete these, the heart's rhythm becomes unstable. Mohammed Benaziza's 1992 death was the most publicized diuretic casualty. Multiple bodybuilders collapsed on stage during competitions. Albert Beckles seized on stage in 1988 and required emergency intervention. Paul Dillett suffered extreme cramping at the 1994 Arnold Classic and had to be carried from stage. Both survived, but both came dangerously close to cardiac arrest. The grotesque calculation bodybuilders make is that aesthetic benefit is worth mortality risk. They understand intellectually that insulin can kill them, that diuretics can cause cardiac arrest. But standing on stage with perfect conditioning, dry, hard, shredded, is the only outcome that matters. Survival is secondary to appearance. This inverted priority makes sense within competitive bodybuilding's framework. Winning a major show generates $50,000 to $100,000 in prize money plus sponsorships. That financial incentive, combined with psychological investment, overrides rational risk assessment. Insulin and diuretics represent second-generation bodybuilding pharmacology. Steroids built the foundation. Insulin and diuretics added finishing details. And the finishing details killed people faster than the foundation ever did. The ending that isn't an ending. The documentary evidence ends here, but the story doesn't conclude. Return to Vienna, 1954. Dr. Ziegler sits in the Rathauskeller Tavern listening to a drunk Soviet physician describe testosterone injections. The Russian's hands shake. His skin looks wrong. He's 34 and looks 50. Ziegler doesn't yet understand that he's witnessing a preview, that the Soviet sitting across from him represents the future of every athlete who will follow the chemical path he's about to open. Ziegler will give American lifters their first Dianabol in 1959. Bill March will press 354.5 pounds. By 1967, Ziegler will quit in disgust. By 1983, he'll be dead from heart disease, condemning the culture he created with his final breaths. David Jenkins will build a $100 million empire. Dan DeShane will write the handbook. Dr. Kerr will treat 10,000 athletes. Dr. Zahorian will serve 3 years. Dr. Astafan will inject Ben Johnson 50 times and destroy his career. East Germany will systematically dope 9,000 athletes, convict 2 officials, and pay modest compensation. Andreas Münzer will die at 31 with a 636-gram heart and a liver like polystyrene. Mohammed Benaziza will die hours after winning, too dehydrated to walk. Mike Matarazzo will wait for a heart transplant he'll never receive. Steve McCallick will commit suicide after decades of organ failure. Arnold Schwarzenegger will admit to 100 milligrams testosterone per week and 15 milligrams Dianabol per day. Sergio Oliva will say, "We all did it." Frank Zane will code Dianabol in his training diary. The entire golden era will eventually confess what everyone already knew. Gold's Gym Venice will become the mecca where pharmaceutical knowledge passes from generation to generation. Mexican pharmacies will supply trunk loads. Underground labs will replace pharmaceutical companies. Finaplix pellets will be extracted and converted. Insulin will cause hypoglycemic collapses. Diuretics will stop hearts. Congress will pass the 1990 Anabolic Steroids Control Act despite opposition from FDA, DA, NIDA, and AMA. The underground will adapt. Quality will decrease. Prices will increase. the death toll will accumulate. And throughout all of it, men will stand in front of mirrors looking at physiques that would have been considered impossible in 1950 and thinking, not big enough, not hard enough, not dry enough, more drugs, higher doses, longer cycles. The chemicals want to be fed. The transformation as possession metaphor remains unresolved. Were these men making free choices about their bodies, or were they caught in something that overrode choice? Did steroids simply allow them to realize genetic potential, or did steroids rewrite them into something other than themselves? The medical evidence suggests the latter. Chronic supraphysiological androgen exposure alters brain structure, changes neuroreceptor density, disrupts body image processing, and creates psychological dependence patterns identical to addiction. The men believed they were using steroids. The steroids were using them. But belief and mechanism are separate questions. Subjectively, the experience was possession. The drugs demanded feeding. The mirror showed inadequacy. The body became alien. Identity dissolved into perpetual enlargement. Pain became pleasure. Torture became routine. The line between self and project erased. Was it worth it? The question assumes a binary between cost and benefit. But for men whose entire identities were built around their physiques, the question was meaningless. The alternative to continuing was psychological annihilation. The choice was use or die, not physical death, but death of the self they become. Some stopped and rebuilt identities based on something other than muscle. Most never stopped. They used into their 40s, 50s, 60s, watching their organs fail, accepting early death as the price of maintaining the transformation. The horror isn't that they didn't know the risks. The horror is that they knew perfectly well and decided the risks were acceptable. Mike Matarazzo warned everyone in 2005. Andreas Münzer's autopsy was published. The death toll was public. And still, another generation injected. The 1990 Anabolic Steroids Control Act drew a legal line. But legal lines don't stop behavior serving psychological needs that deep. The underground adapted. The trade continued. The dosages escalated. The compound became more exotic. Veterinary drugs replaced pharmaceuticals. Insulin joined the stack. Diuretics finished the preparation. The contest season cycle became permanent blasts and cruise protocols. And through it all, the question Ziegler first asked himself in that Vienna tavern in 1954 remained unanswered. If you can chemically rewrite human physical limits, should you? The answer can't come from science because science only describes mechanisms, not meanings. It can't come from law because law only prohibits. It doesn't resolve. It can't come from medicine because medicine can't prevent voluntary self-harm by competent adults. The answer can only come from the individual standing in front of the mirror with a needle in one hand and a reflection they don't recognize in the other. The answer is binary. Inject or don't inject. Everything else is rationalization. Return one final time to Vienna. The Soviet physician is describing enlarged liver, split skin, vertical ridges in the nails. He's describing the future. Ziegler doesn't recognize it yet. He thinks he's hearing about an edge in athletic competition. He doesn't understand he's hearing about Münzer's autopsy 42 years before it happens. That misunderstanding defines the entire story. Everyone thought they were pursuing perfection. What they were actually doing was conducting uncontrolled pharmaceutical experiments on themselves. The experiments produced temporary perfection and permanent damage. The damage compounded. The bills came due. And the pursuit never stopped because stopping felt worse than dying. Was it madness or rational choice? Was it possession or agency? Was it breakthrough or breakdown? The evidence supports all interpretations simultaneously. The ambiguity is intentional. The truth is probably somewhere in the uncomfortable space between voluntary and involuntary, where choice exists but context makes certain choices nearly inevitable. The pink pills opened a door. The door led to a room where mirrors lie, bodies become alien, and identity dissolves into chemical dependency. Some men walked through voluntarily. Some were pushed. Most were somewhere between, choosing but not freely, understanding but not accepting, seeing but not believing. The door remains open. Every generation walks through. The warnings accumulate. The death toll grows. And still the question persists. If you could be more than human, would you accept the cost of being less than healthy? The documentary ends here because the story hasn't ended. It won't end until someone closes the door. But the door can't be closed because the door is the mirror, and the mirror shows infinite possibility on one side and catastrophic consequence on the other. And no one who looks long enough ever walks away. They inject, and the chemicals build, and the body keeps receipts. And eventually, always, the bill comes due,